At one point, there were over 100 obelisks throughout the whole of Egypt. These massive stone pillars, symbolizing the sun god and the authority of the pharaoh, were often placed in pairs at the entrances of temples. Obelisks, many of which are more than 3,000 years old, were seen alongside pyramids as quintessential architectural symbols of Egypt. However, only 6 of these obelisks remain in Egypt today. Many were lost over time due to erosion or were destroyed in wars, but a significant number were taken by Western powers. The Western powers have long been captivated by a desire to possess these irreplaceable pieces of history. Whenever the opportunity arose, they would mobilize substantial resources and manpower to transport these massive stones overseas. But what was it about these obelisks that made them so coveted by so many? There are at least 20 obelisks currently being held overseas, though this number varies depending on the source. The known obelisks are confirmed to have been made in ancient Egypt, and their original temple locations have been identified. By looking at the cities where these obelisks now stand, and the people most closely associated with them, we can infer the meaning and significance of these pillars. Rome, Italy, has the highest concentration of obelisks, with 13 in the city and 3 more in nearby cities like Florence. These millennia-old obelisks tower over the landscape at popular tourist destinations, like the Pantheon, Piazza Navona, the Spanish Steps, and Piazza del Popolo. The beginnings of this trend started with Emperor Augustus, the first emperor of the Roman Empire. Around 30 BC, after conquering Egypt, Augustus transported an estimated 10 obelisks from Egyptian temples to various locations in Rome. Emperor Augustus, who ascended to power at the age of just 33 after defeating the alliance of Mark Antony and Cleopatra of Egypt, was considered young even by Roman standards of the time. As such, establishing his authority as emperor was of paramount importance, especially as he had transitioned Rome from a republic to an empire, a change that led to the dissatisfaction of certain factions. Throughout history, a common means of displaying authority and flaunting power has been through large-scale public works. In line with this, Augustus began an extensive refurbishment of Rome. He built bridges, expanded roads, and constructed imposing government buildings. The crown jewel of these renovations was the placement of obelisks brought over from Egypt throughout the city. These massive obelisks, standing 20 to 30 meters tall and weighing 200 to 400 tons, were perfect symbols of the emperor's strength and the grandeur of the empire as the perilous journey these obelisks made across the Mediterranean Sea from Egypt to Rome was a challenge that could only be undertaken with the strength of the empire under the leadership of the emperor. Each time one of these exotic pillars arrived in Rome, the public celebrated, and with each celebration, Augustus' power was further solidified. This is why historian Edward Gibbon, in his renowned work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, noted that, in those times, the obelisks were considered monuments of power and victory. While in Egypt, obelisks symbolized the worship of the sun god, in Rome they came to represent the sun itself, signifying the eternal nature of the empire. These obelisks were seen as sacred symbols of enduring prosperity, and it was believed that only a nation that possessed them could rule the world. This Roman appropriation of obelisks initiated by Augustus continued under subsequent emperors. In the 4th century, Emperor Theodosius I transported an obelisk from the Karnak Temple in Egypt and placed it in what is now Sultanahmet Square in Istanbul. Coincidentally, Istanbul later became the capital of both the Byzantine and Ottoman empires, truly ruling the world for an extended period. The obelisk brought to Rome by the notorious Emperor Caligula now stands in the middle of St. Peter's Square in Vatican City. While the presence of a pagan symbol at the heart of Catholicism may initially seem incongruous, the late 16th century Pope Sixtus V actually intended it to be so. During that time, the Catholic Church was reeling from the effects of the Reformation and needed a symbol to assert the Pope's authority. Thus, Caligula's neglected obelisk was moved to the Vatican, and a cross was placed on its summit as if to proclaim Catholicism's dominance over other religions. After the fall of Rome, the plundering of obelisks saw a brief respite, but it resumed with the resurgence of imperialism in Europe, led by Napoleon Bonaparte of France. The history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, which referred to obelisks as monuments of power, also inspired Napoleon's imperial ambitions. Motivated by these writings, Napoleon became an ardent admirer of Egyptian civilization. On his expedition to Egypt at the end of the 18th century, he brought hundreds of scholars, including historians, archaeologists, and architects, to collect valuable artifacts. There are even stories stating that his wife, Josephine, asked for an obelisk as a souvenir. Napoleon's dream of possessing an obelisk was only realized posthumously, however. Although officially presented as a gift, Egypt's subsequent request for its return suggests it was more likely coerced in its initial actions. It took France 2 years just to build a ship and crane capable of transporting the massive stone. From Luxor to Paris, the journey of the obelisk then took another 7 years. Finally, in 1836, the obelisk was erected in the Place de la Concorde in Paris, the very site where King Louis XVI was guillotined during the French Revolution, symbolically declaring France as the center of the world. Even France, the world's leading superpower at the time, balked at the prospect of transporting a second obelisk due to the immense difficulties such a task inevitably brought with it. Originally, France was to receive 2 obelisks, those that had stood guard at the Luxor Temple since the era of Ramses II over 3,300 years ago. However, after asserting ownership for many years, France finally returned the obelisk to Egypt in 1981. In return for the obelisk, France sent a large clock to Egypt, but it broke down in less than a decade. This clock, its hands frozen in time, still remains in Cairo, the capital of Egypt. In the midst of these events, the United Kingdom, filled with the pride and hubris of being the empire on which the sun never sets, could not remain idle. Britain, citing its role in thwarting Napoleon's control over Egypt, requested an obelisk from the Ottoman Viceroy of Egypt. Eventually, the UK acquired a 3,500-year-old obelisk, known as Cleopatra's Needle, standing 21 meters tall. In 1878, after considerable expense and effort, Britain successfully erected the obelisk on the banks of the River Thames in London, showcasing its status as a world power. This obsession with obelisks was no different in the emerging empire of the United States. In 1881, the New York Herald published an article stating, "There are obelisks in Rome and Constantinople. Recently, Paris acquired one and London too. If New York lacks an obelisk, other major cities will mock it." This sentiment reflected the continued belief that possessing an obelisk was essential for recognition as a global power. The United States eventually realized this ambition. The Egyptian Khedive gifted an obelisk, another Cleopatra's Needle, to the U.S., even after mobilizing its naval resources. It still took 2.5 years to transport the massive stone tower to New York, where it was installed in Central Park in 1881. However, America's aspirations did not stop there. 3 years later, the U.S. constructed its own towering obelisk in Washington, D.C., the Washington Monument, standing 170 meters tall. Ostensibly a tribute to the first President George Washington, it was unmistakably an obelisk. Following its construction, the U.S. did indeed come to hold significant global influence. Thus, obelisks have long been monuments of imperialism and symbols of world hegemony. But was it really the obelisks that these empires desired? Probably not. Had it been feasible, these empires would likely have chosen pyramids instead. Such is the nature of human greed and lust for power. In this sense, obelisks might even be considered a secondary choice, a case of, if you can't have the best, go for the next best thing.